The fluorescent lights hummed their endless song at Oak Creek Memorial, a sound that most people stopped hearing after 3 weeks. Laura Bennett had stopped hearing it 3 years ago. 2:17 in the morning, and the ICU corridor stretched empty except for the soft pad of her shoes on tile, professional-grade nursing clogs with the tread worn down on the left side from favoring her left leg, an old habit she couldn't break. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever did. She moved through the ward with the kind of quiet efficiency that gets labeled competent but unremarkable. That was the point. That had always been the point since she accepted the new Social Security number and the warning that came with it: never surface, never volunteer, never let anyone see what you actually are. Laura Bennett, night shift nurse, 3 years at Raleigh's largest medical center, always taking the shifts nobody else wanted, never attending the staff holiday parties, never letting anyone get close enough to ask questions. The other nurses called her steady. Cold, sometimes. Dependable, always. Her rounds took her past the medication dispensary where the bitter smell of hand sanitizer lived in layers, past the central monitoring station where 12 different heart rhythms traced their electronic stories across a wall of screens, past the room where an elderly man with sepsis lay fighting his own losing battle. Laura checked his full-line, 14-gauge angiocath, clean, no signs of infiltration, and adjusted his medication drip without speaking. The patient was sedated. Communication wouldn't help him. Neither would words. During her 2 a.m. bathroom break, she locked the stall door and reached inside her jacket lining. The movement was automatic now, ritualized, something she did when the weight of 3 years got too heavy. Her fingertips found the patch, faded field green, the edges worn soft from handling. She didn't take it out where anyone could see. Just touched it through the fabric. Unit insignia. Ghost soldiers. Men whose names got redacted from official records, whose faces disappeared under government markers. The patch was the only piece of Major Laura Bennett she'd allowed herself to keep after the black site in Tikrit, after the convoy attack that was officially supposed to have killed her, after the new name and the new Social Security number and the new life where nobody knew she'd spent 6 years running combat trauma operations across theaters they didn't teach in nursing school. She washed her hands in cold water. Muscle memory made the movement precise: nail beds, palms, between fingers, 3 passes. Same way she used to prep for field surgery under canvas tents with mortar fire cracking the sky open. The soap smelled like coconut. Civilian soap. Everything about this life smelled like civilian soap. Back at the nurse's station, James from the graveyard shift was staring at his computer with the exhausted expression of a man trying to chart on no sleep. "Bennett, you want some coffee? This batch is only 4 hours old. Might still have some flavor if we're lucky," he offered without looking up. "I'm fine," Laura said. She was always fine. That was the performance that had kept her invisible for 36 months. The night moved with its usual rhythm, vitals checks, medication administrations, the slow progression of hours that felt both infinite and immediate. Around her, the hospital breathed its mechanical rhythm. The ventilators wheezed their metronome pulse. The heart monitors beeped their private conversations, 123, 123, the percussion section of people staying alive through machines. The intercom crackled occasionally with overhead pages that never seemed urgent enough to wake the sleeping patients, measured announcements about missing equipment or staff meetings scheduled for next Tuesday. Dr. Marcus Ashford emerged from his office around 2:45 a.m. with the kind of presence that made air pressure change. Tall, 48, with the silver-threaded hair that successful men accumulated like trophies. He'd been the ICU medical director for 15 years, a tenure that had calcified into something closer to dictatorial control. He ruled through surgical precision, board connections, carefully maintained relationships with hospital administrators, a talent for identifying threat and neutralizing it before it became public. His voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. He'd built an entire department in his image, competent, rigid, hierarchical. Doctors above nurses, protocols above instinct, his word as law. Laura had learned to move around men like him. She'd seen his type in the military, officers who mistook rank for actual authority, who confused power with the ability to help. She kept her head down, did her work, asked no questions. Questioned no protocols. When Dr. Ashford made rounds, she was already moving to the next patient, already focused somewhere else. Invisible. But Ashford noticed things. That was his gift and his flaw, the same attention to detail that made him an effective physician made him paranoid about threats. He'd noticed, for instance, that Laura sometimes adjusted ventilator settings before he suggested them, her hands moving with an instinctiveness that suggested she understood respiratory mechanics at a level that shouldn't exist in someone with her job title. He'd noticed 3 months ago when she gently questioned his decision to delay antibiotics for a septic patient by 17 minutes, and how her quiet suggestion, his lactates trending up, "Doctor, might want to move up that first dose," had turned out to be exactly right. He didn't like being questioned. He didn't like nurses who thought. He preferred competence of the obedient variety. Laura was setting up the medication tray for room 407 when the intercom crackled. Incoming trauma alert. Navy Captain Richard Hale, acute respiratory distress, respiratory rate 34 and climbing, O2 sat 78 on high flow. ETA for minutes. The coffee cup slipped from her hand. It didn't shatter dramatically. It didn't drop from some great height. It simply lost its grip on reality and fell to the tile floor, releasing 3 hours of cold bitter coffee into a spreading stain. The cup itself broke into 4 pieces. She registered this detail with clinical precision, the way her brain still processed information, sharp fragments, a nice clean fracture pattern, the kind of break that looked almost surgical. Nobody was looking at her. James was already pulling up the trauma room, moving with the muscle memory of night shift nurses who'd done this 1,000 times. The other RN on duty was calling for the respiratory tech. The orderlies were moving toward the elevator. Standard choreography. Nobody noticed that Laura had gone very still, that her hands had clenched, that something had shifted in her chest like a door slamming in a house she'd boarded up 3 years ago. But Ashford noticed. He was watching her from near the central station, his gaze tracking the fallen coffee cup, tracking back to her face, tracking across something he couldn't quite name. Weakness. That's what he saw. A moment of instability in a nurse who was supposed to be reliable. A tremor in the performance. And where most doctors might have felt concern or asked if she was all right, Ashford felt something closer to satisfaction. A weakness to exploit. A reason to remove someone whose competence threatened the dominance he'd spent 15 years building. "Bennett," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she would hear it clearly. "Grab a towel. Contaminated floor is a OSHA violation." She moved to get the paper towels, because that's what you do when someone speaks in that tone. That's what you do when you're trying to be invisible. But as she passed him on the way to clean up the coffee, she felt his eyes tracking her like a predator assessing the herd. The trauma team assembled in Bay 3, 2 residents, a respiratory therapist, a trauma surgeon who looked like he'd been sleeping in his car. Laura changed out of her contaminated scrubs and was standing in the bay entrance when they wheeled Captain Richard Hale through the doors on a stretcher that seemed too narrow for the chaos surrounding him. She knew that face. She'd testified against it in a military courtroom in Baghdad, not with words but with the weight of her silence while this man, this naval JG officer with careful eyes and the kind of composure that came from prosecuting people for decisions made under fire, destroyed her career with surgical precision. The court-martial after Tikrit had been public, clean, efficient. He'd been the face of accountability. She'd been the cautionary tale. 3 years. 3 years since she'd seen Captain Richard Hale, and now he lay on a stretcher with his oxygen sat dropping and his breathing ragged as a wounded animal's, and her body responded before her mind could catch up. Her hand started moving toward the bedside before she'd consciously decided to move. Muscle memory was taking over, the kind of instinct that came from 6 years of emergency trauma operations where thinking too much got people killed. She stopped at the doorway. One measured breath. Composed. Professional. Unremarkable. Ashford was already moving into the bay, already positioning himself at the head of the bed, already assuming command. Laura watched from the threshold as he began his assessment, as the room organized itself around the hierarchy of his authority. This was his domain. His rules. His patient. She was just a nurse. She was just a nurse, and the man who'd court-martialed her was dying, and her hands knew exactly what he needed, and the only thing keeping her invisible was the simple discipline of watching from the doorway instead of moving in. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The monitor above Captain Hale's bed displayed vital signs that didn't lie: oxygen saturation at 91% and sliding, neck veins distending like cords beneath his skin, breath sounds absent on the right side. Laura had seen this pattern before, in a dust-choked compound in Tikrit where a young Marine took shrapnel to the chest cavity and his lung collapsed while bureaucrats argued about chain of command. She moved toward the bedside, her mind already calculating the physics of air pressure and tissue compromise, when Dr. Ashford stepped into her path like a gate closing. "Step back, Nurse Bennett. I'll handle Officer Hale personally." His voice carried the particular coldness of a man who'd learned that authority didn't require volume, only certainty. Laura had encountered this breed before, in officers' clubs and Pentagon hallways, men whose power came not from what they could do but from who they knew wouldn't contradict them. Ashford was 47, with the kind of tan that suggested ski trips to Vale, and his presence had the texture of expensive soap and the faint chemical sweetness of hair product. She checked the monitor anyway, her eyes taking in the data, the deviating trachea, the unequal chest expansion, the blood pressure climbing as the body's alarm system triggered. "Doctor, his trachea is deviating. He needs immediate decompression." Her voice was level, the kind of calm that came from having given similar warnings in conditions where the next 60 seconds determined survival probability. Ashford's laugh was quiet and deliberate, the kind designed to carry to the small cluster of people visible through the ICU window: a nurses, a resident, and the woman holding Captain Hale's hand. "His daughter. Claire." Laura registered her tear-streaked face and the way her fingers gripped her father's arm as if pressure alone could keep him tethered to this side of consciousness. "I don't recall asking for diagnostics from a night shift nurse who barely passed her boards." Ashford's words came with the precision of a surgeon making a calculated cut. "Why don't you stick to emptying bedpans, That seems more your speed." The monitor beeped its steady, increasingly urgent rhythm. Ashford turned to Claire with the practiced warmth of a man accustomed to being believed. "Don't worry, we have actual doctors here. Your father is in excellent hands." Laura took one measured breath. The kind of breath taught in combat trauma schools, in rooms where screaming soldiers learned to compartmentalize pain into something they could work around. Her fingers were steady as she adjusted the oxygen line, checked the IV, logged his vitals in the system without another word. Ashford watched her with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd established dominance. He had no idea that the trembling building behind her sternum wasn't fear, it was the precise, controlled fury of someone who'd been trained to recognize when a decision was being made that would cost a life. One tear escaped as she read Hale's chart. She wiped it away without breaking her stare across the nurse's station toward Ashford's silhouette. He was already turning away, already forgetting her. That was his first mistake. The break room at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that came from a space where no one lingered by choice. The microwave hummed its mechanical complaint. A fluorescent light panel flickered with the persistence of a dying thing that refused to fully surrender. Laura pushed open the door at 12:22 p.m., her shift meal break wedged between medication rounds and discharge paperwork, expecting solitude and the kind of silence that came from being invisible. Instead, the room went dead silent. Amy Reeves was there, Amy who'd shadowed Laura for 3 months on nights, who'd asked 1,000 careful questions about how to talk to families after loss, who'd written Laura a thank you card after her first successful first start on a difficult pediatric patient. She glanced up from her turkey sandwich, made eye contact for precisely 0.3 seconds, then gathered her tray and left without a word. Marcus followed 15 seconds later, muttering sorries as he passed, the apology meant for something deeper than social awkwardness. Within 2 minutes, the room had emptied until Laura stood alone beside the refrigerator that hummed like a creature in pain. She sat at a table scarred with coffee rings and the ghost impressions of spilled things, placed her lunch container down, and didn't open it. Through the break room window, she could see the nurse's station. She could see Ashford standing with his arms folded, speaking in low tones to two members of the hospital board. She could see the moment he gestured toward the break room, not obviously, just a flick of his eyes, a slight turn of his shoulders. Confirmation to the men he was speaking with, look at her, the problem. It was the coordinated nature of the exodus that told her the truth. Nothing happened at Oak Creek Memorial without Ashford's orchestration. He'd cultivated this place the way a gardener cultivates soil, with patience, with an understanding of which plants could coexist and which needed to be removed. The nurses weren't avoiding her because they believed Ashford's version of events. They were avoiding her because remaining visible in her proximity had consequences, because Ashford had communicated, without words, which was the key to his power, that association with Laura Bennett was career-limiting. He'd done this before. She could see it in how quickly they complied, how automatic the rejection felt. The next morning, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board, pinned at eye level in the center of the station where no one could miss it. Laura's name was printed in bold across the top, incident report, disciplinary action. Beneath it, in the clinical language of institutional accountability, insubordination and diagnostic overreach beyond scope of nursing practice. Employee attempted to override physician assessment and made statements to patient family that undermined clinical confidence. Pattern of protocol violations documented. Mandatory remedial education required. Ashford's signature was precise and small, the handwriting of a man who believed his name alone carried weight. Laura read it 3 times, each word registering with the precision of a final report, a notification of loss. She was aware of people watching her, the subtle shift of attention, the calculated avoidance of eye contact from those who'd already decided which side of this conflict offered them safety. When she looked up from the paper, Ashford was watching from across the nurse's station. His arms were folded. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The write-up was his smile, translated into official language and institutional backing. One tear escaped before she could prevent it. She wiped it away without blinking, without breaking her gaze, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing weakness. That single tear meant nothing. It was just water. The stare was everything, the message delivered silently across 20 feet of institutional space, I see you. I understand what you've done. I will remember. Ashford's expression didn't change. He turned and walked into his office, closing the door with the deliberate gentleness of a man absolutely certain of his position. 2 days later, the morning staff meeting convened in the small conference room where Laura had attended 5 previous briefings without incident. She took her usual seat near the back, a habit born from military training, never corner yourself, always see the exits, position yourself where you can observe without being observed. Ashford stood at the head of the table, fresh coffee steaming in his hands, the kind of physical ease that came from knowing you controlled the room's outcome before anyone spoke. Some nurses, he began, his voice carrying the tone of casual observation, forget their place in the medical hierarchy. They think a few years of training, community college prerequisites, mostly, makes them qualified to second-guess board-certified physicians. He set his coffee down. His eyes didn't find Laura directly, but every other eye in the room found her like a compass needle orienting to magnetic north. I call these types nurse hero. Dangerous. Reckless. They've watched too much television and not enough, well, actual medicine. Laura sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table in front of her. Her jaw remained unclenched. Her breathing stayed even. She'd learned composure in a medical tent in Kandahar where the option to react emotionally wasn't available, casualties kept coming, an emotional response was a luxury that cost lives. She applied that muscle memory now, letting Ashford's words move through her like weather, noted but not internalized. When he finished, he looked directly at her, first real acknowledgement. The room held its breath. Laura met his gaze with the flat, unreadable calm of someone who'd already calculated all possible outcomes and found them all acceptable. When capped in Hale codes because you missed an obvious tension pneumothorax, she said quietly, her voice low enough that people had to lean forward to hear her, I hope your ego survives the autopsy report. The silence was immediate and complete. It had weight, that silence. It pressed against the walls and made the fluorescent light seem louder somehow, their electrical hum suddenly audible over the absence of breath, of movement, of anything resembling normal human function. Ashford's smile appeared like a predator recognizing prey that would make a satisfying kill. He didn't respond verbally. He simply pulled out his phone and stood, excusing himself from the meeting with a polite gesture. Through the glass walls of the conference room, Laura watched him walk to his office. She watched him close the door. She watched him place the phone to his ear and speak for 6 minutes, his face visible in profile, animated, certain, the expression of a man solving a problem he'd already anticipated. He was calling the board. She knew this the way she'd known about tension pneumothorax in a deteriorating patient, through pattern recognition, through accumulated experience in high-stakes environments, through the certain knowledge of how institutional power actually functioned. This wasn't Ashford losing control. This was Ashford implementing the strategy he'd outlined to himself the moment he saw her in Hale's doorway and recognized weakness he could exploit. The other nurses filed out of the conference room slowly, avoiding her space entirely. Amy didn't make eye contact. Marcus didn't try. The new resident, a young woman named Sarah, actually stepped around Laura's chair rather than walk past her, as if proximity itself were contagious. Laura remained at the table until everyone had left. Then she stood, placed her chair under the desk with precise movements, and returned to the unit. Her schedule, she would discover, had been changed overnight. She was being reassigned to the subacute floor effective immediately, away from critical patients, away from the ICU, away from Captain Hale. Ashford had made his move with surgical precision. And he was absolutely certain she had no way to counter it. The next morning, Laura arrived at Oak Creek Memorial at 6:48 a.m., 13 minutes before shift start, same as always. She badged into the employee entrance and felt it immediately, the weight of eyes tracking her path down the corridor. The unit board displayed the weekly schedule. Her name had been moved. Subacute floor. 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. No ICU. No critical patients. No Captain Hale. She stared at the printout for 4 seconds. Then she walked to the break room, poured black coffee into a mug with a hairline crack, and sat at the corner table. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry insects. She didn't flinch. She didn't call anyone. She simply existed in the silence and waited for Amy Chen to arrive. Amy came through the door at 6:58 a.m. carrying her lunch bag and wearing the careful expression of someone about to deliver bad news. She stopped when she saw Laura. The hesitation lasted exactly 2 heartbeats. Laura. Amy sat down carefully, as if the chair might break. You need to know something. I'm listening. Ashford has been making calls since 5 in the morning. Quiet ones, but... Amy lowered her voice, even though the break room was empty. He's reassigning everyone from your rotation. Marcus to pediatrics, starting today. Jessica got moved to the post-op floor for the week. Even Tom, who's been here 9 years, he's suddenly floating surgical now. Laura sipped her coffee. It was still too hot. She sipped it anyway. That's not a coincidence, Amy continued. He's isolating you. Taking away anyone who might vouch for you or, I don't know, back you up if something happens. How many? What? How many people has he reassigned? That I know of? 5. Maybe 6. But Laura, there's more. Amy glanced toward the doorway. He sent out an email this morning. Your ICU access has been restricted. You have to have supervisor approval to enter the unit now. He said it in the memo, pattern of protocol concerns requiring escalated oversight. The words landed like stones in still water. Restricted access. That meant no more checking on patients she'd been monitoring, no more Hale. That was the point, of course. Ashford wasn't just punishing her. He was systematically removing her ability to help anyone. He was building a case where she had no choice but to look incompetent or reckless. Laura set down her coffee mug. The crack in its lip caught the light. When? She asked. The email went out at 5:22 a.m. But that's not all. You have a meeting. Emergency peer review. 3 p.m. today. In Ashford's office. He's called in the department chair and 2 board members. Amy's voice dropped further. I heard him on the phone with Janet from HR. He kept saying documented pattern and insubordination. Laura, I think he's building a termination case. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a trap closing. Laura understood now what Ashford was doing. He wasn't attacking anymore. He was constructing. Each move was a precision strike: isolate her allies, restrict her access, build administrative evidence, schedule a formal review where 3 senior people would sit across from her and hear only his version of the truth. By 3 o'clock this afternoon, the groundwork would be complete. She'd seen this before. Not in a hospital. In a courtroom in Baghdad where a JAG officer named Richard Hale had built a case against a major named Laura Bennett with the same methodical competence, the same absence of emotion, the same certainty that the institutional system would protect him. Thank you, Laura said to Amy. For telling me. What are you going to do? Show up for my shift on the subacute floor. Do my job. Attend the meeting at 3. That's it? That's all you're going to do? Laura stood. She placed her hands flat on the break room table, hands that had held lives together in Tikrit and Baghdad and 3 other places that didn't exist on any official map. Hands that would carry her through the next 9 hours. What else would you suggest? Her voice was level. Not cold. Not angry. Just level, like a horizon extending in all directions. Amy didn't answer. The subacute floor was a different world from the ICU. No ventilators. No crash cart staged at the hallway intersection. No families sleeping in recliners outside patient rooms. Just 12 private beds with people recovering from pneumonia, post-op infections, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Healing trajectory. Stable vitals. Minimal drama. Laura moved through her patient assignments with methodical precision. 7:15 a.m., vitals on room 4301. 7:42 a.m., medication pass on the south wing. 8:13 a.m., discharge paperwork for the patient in 4214. Each task was smaller than the last, a deliberate reduction of her sphere of influence. By moving her here, Ashford had effectively made her invisible. The subacute floor was where nurses went when they weren't trusted with critical decision-making anymore. It was a way station to termination. At 9:51 a.m., while she was administering for antibiotics to a post-op appendectomy patient, her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. A text from an unknown number, * security checkpoint required for ICU entry effective immediately. Supervisor override needed per Dr. Ashford directive. *. She didn't respond. She finished the medication, flushed the line with saline, and documented the entry in the electronic medical record. The patient, a woman named Margaret, 63 years old, recovering from surgery, watched her with the kind of gratitude that made everything harder. "You're so good at this," Margaret said. "You have such steady hands." Laura didn't tell her that those hands were about to become irrelevant. That in 6 hours, a peer review board would convene and decide whether those hands deserved to keep working in this hospital or anywhere else. She simply smiled, a small, genuine smile, and told Margaret she'd check on her at lunchtime. The morning stretched across 3 more hours. Noon arrived. Laura had lunch at 12:15, the same corner table in the break room, though this time no one sat with her. The other nurses on this floor didn't know her. They wouldn't have known to isolate her anyway. Ashford's redistribution of staff meant she was working with people who'd never seen her in a crisis, never watched her work, never had a frame of reference for who she was except what Ashford had told them. Which was protocol violation, insubordination, unsafe judgment. At 1:44 p.m., she changed out of her scrubs and put on clean ones. The faded unit patch was still there in her jacket lining, sewn in with careful stitches 3 years ago when she'd first stepped through the doors of Oak Creek Memorial. She'd never sewn anything in her military career. The embroidery was rough, the stitching uneven, but it held. The patch was from her unit in Tikrit, not her official designation, but the unofficial call sign, the Angels. That's what the SEAL teams had called her medical element. Asterisk the Angels are coming. Asterisk it meant someone was about to survive. Nobody looking at Laura Bennett now would see an angel. They would see a night shift nurse with an unremarkable 8-year record who'd made some unfortunate decisions and was about to lose her job. She climbed the stairs to the administrative wing at 2:52 p.m. 8 minutes early. Never too early, never too late. That was strategy too. At 2:58, she knocked on Ashford's office door. "Enter," he called. The office was arranged to maximize his advantage. Ashford sat behind his desk, mahogany, expensive, positioned so the light from the window behind him made him silhouette dark and authoritative. To his right sat Janet Wu from HR, thin-lipped and holding a file folder. To his left, the department chair, Dr. Marcus Reeves, who'd never spoken a word to Laura in the 3 years she'd worked here. And behind them, positioned slightly back in a chair that faced the three of them, was a board member, a woman named Susan Kattenberg, whose name appeared on hospital stationery and who Laura recognized from a staff photo in the main lobby. For versus 1. Ashford had stacked the room with people who owed him something: budget approvals, salary negotiations, schedule flexibility. This wasn't a peer review. This was an execution. "Nurse Bennett, thank you for being punctual," Ashford said. His voice was smooth, the voice of a man who'd already won. "Please sit." Laura sat in the single chair facing them. She placed her hands in her lap and waited. "We've called this emergency peer review," Ashford began, opening a file, based on a pattern of concerning behaviors over the past 48 hours. "Ms. Wu will document, but I want to walk through what we've observed." He was good. Laura had to grant him that. He presented the write-up from yesterday's incident, formal, typed, dated, as if it were objective fact. He presented her reassignment to subacute as a standard procedural move. Then he opened a second file. "Additionally, we've begun reviewing your personnel records as part of standard background verification protocols. And we've identified some inconsistencies we need to address." He looked up at her over his reading glasses. "Your employment history before joining Oak Creek Memorial in 2020 is sparse. No documented employer references. No verifiable medical positions. Your education records reference a school that closed in 2019. Your licensing verification came through, but there's a significant gap in your professional history." Laura didn't move. She didn't blink. "Can you explain that gap?" Ashford asked. "I was taking care of a family member," Laura said quietly. "Personal leave. Unpaid." It was exactly what her false documentation said. The Department of Defense had crafted this identity with precision. Laura Bennett, the nurse, had all the credentials. She had the right certifications, the right exam scores, the right paper trail, except for that gap where Major Laura Bennett had technically ceased to exist in any official capacity that someone could verify. "For how long?" Susan Kattenberg asked. 18 months. "And during that time you were, what, exactly?" "Personal leave. As I said." Ashford smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who'd found exactly what he was looking for. "We have concerns about the verifiability of your background. This, combined with yesterday's insubordination and protocol violations, suggests a pattern of behavior that makes us question your fitness for this position." He had her. He had her completely. There was no way to defend herself without revealing the truth, and revealing the truth would expose everything, not just her identity, but the classified black site program she'd been part of, the military authorization that had erased her, the entire constellation of secrets that had been protecting her for 3 years. She could feel it coming. The firing. The end of this life. The return to nothing. "We're recommending immediate termination," Ashford continued, his voice dropping to that regretful tone doctors use when delivering bad news to people who deserve it. Effective immediately. You're suspended as of this moment. Security will escort you from the building. We'll provide severance in accordance with your contract, but... The intercom on his desk crackled. Dr. Ashford? Security is requesting you in the main lobby. Something about naval intelligence. They're asking for Major Bennett. The room froze. Ashford's hand moved toward the intercom button, but he didn't press it. His face had gone a specific color, not red, not white, but the color of someone who'd just realized the ground beneath him was not solid. Laura stood up slowly. She looked at Ashford, and for the first time since she'd entered this office, she let him see her. Not the night shift nurse. Not the woman with the gap in her resume. Not the person he'd been constructing a termination case against. She looked at him with eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine. Eyes that had calculated how to save lives in environments where death was the only other option. I believe, she said quietly, you have visitors. The intercom crackled at 11:13 p.m. Code blue, ICU. Not the announcement. The tone, that particular frequency that meant everything was collapsing at once. Laura was restocking the supply cart when the announcement came through. Her hands froze on the 4 tubing. She knew that bed. She knew that patient. Captain Richard Hale's monitor had been steady all evening, his oxygen saturation holding at 94%, his breathing shallow but stable. Then something shifted. The body has a way of announcing its own betrayal. She moved toward the ICU without thinking. Her legs carried her forward while her mind screamed at her to stay in the supply closet where it was safe. The doors swished open. The smell hit her first, that acrid copper and antiseptic combination that meant acute hemorrhage. Hale's chest heaved, fighting for air. His face had turned the color of old concrete. The oxygen mask was fogging erratically. Gasping. Drowning on dry land. 2 residents stood at the bedside, paralyzed. One held a clipboard. Neither moved. The ventilator screamed its alarm, a sound like a siren trapped inside machinery, urgent and useless all at once. Dr. Ashford was unreachable. Somewhere in the hospital or nowhere in the hospital. It didn't matter. Laura was the only one moving. She grabbed a procedure tray from the crash cart. Gloved her hands in one motion, muscle memory that never forgot, even when she'd spent 3 years trying to erase it. The plastic packaging of the gauze came free in her left hand. Clear polyethylene. Sterile. Perfect. 14-gauge angiocath. Now, she said to the resident holding the clipboard. Her voice didn't shake. Her voice never shook anymore. His hands fumbled. Found the needle. She took it from him, located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, landmarks her body remembered from trauma bays in Kandahar, from field hospitals under mortar fire, from a kill zone outside Tikrit where she'd done this exact procedure on a Delta operator bleeding out into his own chest cavity. The needle pierced skin and fascia. She felt the give, that singular moment when resistance surrenders. The hiss of air escaping. Beautiful. Terrible. The sound of pressure releasing, of a man's lungs remembering how to expand. O2 sat, she asked the second resident. 76. Rising. 80. 84. Hale's breathing deepened. His color began climbing back from the edge of gray. The panic left his eyes. They'd bought time. Minutes, at minimum. Maybe more if she worked fast. The second procedure was intuitive. The collapsed lung meant the pleural space was bleeding or filling, air where blood should be, blood where air should be. Either way, Hale couldn't survive it for long. Laura opened the gauze package carefully, sealed the needle opening with the plastic wrapper. Tape. Secure. It would hold pressure while buying them the minutes they needed to get him to CT, to imaging, to the operating room where someone with authority and credentials could finish what her hands had started. Sinus rhythm, the resident monitoring the cardiac leads whispered. his stabilizing. The room didn't go silent. That was a luxury they didn't have. Instead, it filled with the normal sounds of recovery, the ventilator settling into rhythm, the heart monitor finding its cadence, the beeping that meant life instead of emergency. Hale's eyes found Laura's for exactly 1 second. Recognition. Understanding. Gratitude mixed with something else, fear, maybe. Or realization. Then Ashford arrived. He moved through the doorway like a man who'd been summoned and wasn't pleased about it. His eyes swept the bed, assessed Hale's color, his oxygen saturation, the homemade chest seal taped over his second intercostal space. His gaze landed on Laura last. She was removing her gloves. Her hands were steady. Her expression was the nothing expression she'd perfected over 3 years of being invisible. "Step back," Ashford said. Not a request. Not for her, specifically. Just a command thrown at the general direction of everyone who wasn't him. He approached the bed, examined the needle, the gauze, the tape. His jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The phone started ringing before Laura had finished washing her hands in the break room. She could hear them from the hallway, Ashford's voice, sharp and controlled, making 3 calls in succession. Board members. She knew the tone. She'd been married once, briefly, and that tone was the one her ex-husband had used when calling his lawyer. The tone of someone who'd decided the gloves were coming off. By 7 a.m., there was a certified letter in her locker. Her name was typed on the envelope in clinical sans serif font. Inside, the language was equally clinical. Termination of employment, effective immediately. Unauthorized medical procedures outside the scope of nursing practice. Pattern of insubordination and overreach. Inability to provide verifiable credentials for employment prior to 2020. That last line sat on the page like a landmine someone had planted 5 years ago and finally detonated. The gap in her resume. The hole where Major Laura Bennett had been erased, where the army had told her to disappear, where she'd been given a new social security number, a severance check, and explicit orders never to surface because the Black Ops rescue she ran outside Tikrit had exposed something so classified that Congress wasn't supposed to know it existed. The convoy attack that officially killed her. The woman who emerged from that erasure was Laura Bennett, the night shift nurse, forgettable and small, the kind of person no one looked at twice. Ashford had found the gap and driven a truck through it. The letter said she had 2 hours to retrieve personal items under security escort. That was professional language for don't steal anything on your way out. Laura packed a cardboard box in the locker room while a security guard named Marcus stood nearby, trying not to look at her. Marcus was good people. He'd seen her feed the stray cat behind the loading dock. He'd never reported her for it. Inside the box, a cracked mug from the gift shop that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded letters. A dying succulent plant that she'd been meaning to water for 3 weeks. And the photograph from Tikrit, her unit standing in front of a Humvee, 14 faces, half of them scratched out by government redaction pen like they'd been erased from reality. She touched the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining one final time. Faded olive drab. The embroidered insignia barely visible after 3 years of wear. That was the only piece of Major Bennett she'd allowed herself to keep. The walk through Oak Creek Memorial felt like a funeral procession in reverse. Instead of one person being carried out, it was one person walking out while everyone else remained. Past the break room where she'd eaten countless lunches alone. Past the nurses' station where her colleagues looked away as though her visibility had become contagious. Past the ICU where Captain Richard Hale lay recovering behind glass, his daughter sitting in a chair beside his bed. Claire saw her being escorted out. Her mouth opened. She started to stand. Then she saw the box, the security guard, the terminated employee walk, and confusion painted itself across her face. Rain started at the front entrance. Not a drizzle. Real rain. The kind that came down in sheets over Raleigh, soaking through her scrubs in seconds, turning the air silver and heavy. Laura walked 3 blocks to a bus stop and set the cardboard box on the wet bench. She sat beside it. The rain immediately began warping the cardboard, softening the corners, darkening the craft paper from tan to brown. The succulent tipped sideways inside the box. Water pooled in her lap. She pulled out the Tikrit photo. Looked at the younger version of herself standing next to men whose names she could recite from muscle memory even though their faces had been scratched away by redaction. The 75th Ranger Regiment patch visible on her old uniform. Major Bennett in that photograph. The version who'd pulled 6 operators from a kill zone while Captain Hale's voice crackled over the radio ordering her to abort the mission, to leave them behind, to follow protocol. She'd saved them anyway. And they'd erased her for it. The rain fell harder. The sky was iron grey. No buses came. The waiting stretched into an hour, then 2, then 3. Laura didn't move. She just sat with the ruined box and the redacted photograph and the faded unit patch she could no longer touch, watching the rain fall on a city where she'd never really existed. That was when the sound changed. At first it was barely audible under the rain, a low thump that she felt in her chest before she heard it. Then it crescendoed into something impossible. The air pressure shifted. The rain scattered in spiraling sheets. 3 Black Hawks descended onto Oak Creek Memorial's front lawn, maybe 200 yards from where she sat, their rotor wash turning the parking lot into a hurricane. She didn't move. She was too tired to move. The military had taken everything, her name, her identity, her service record, her ability to claim any of it. What would a helicopter change? The rain came sideways, the kind that found its way under collars and into the spaces between reason and survival. Laura stood at the bus stop on Fayetteville Street, the cardboard box growing soft in her hands, the photograph trembling not because she was afraid but because her body had finally understood what her mind refused to accept. 3 years. 3 years of being no one, and they'd taken that away in an afternoon, reduced her back to the woman she'd never wanted to become again. The Tikrit photo, her unit in combat gear, half the faces scratched out by government redaction, showed only what remained. Only what they'd allowed her to keep. The other operators, the ones whose names had been erased first, existed now as blank spaces. She'd saved them. She'd pulled them out of that burning compound in the Jolin district, carried them through fire that turned sand to glass, and the government had repaid her by erasing her from existence. Now they were taking even that. She pressed the photo against the cardboard box and closed her eyes. The sound came first, a distant thud that the rain couldn't quite swallow. Then another. Then a third, the rhythm unmistakable to anyone who'd ever heard it at altitude. Rotor wash. Laura's eyes opened. The sky above Raleigh split open, and 3 UH-60M Black Hawks descended on Oak Creek Memorial's front lawn like a judgment. The downwash flattened the grass, shattered the rain into horizontal sheets, scattered visitors screaming back toward the hospital entrance. The aircraft didn't land gently. They settled with the gravity of finality, their blades still turning, creating a wind tunnel that turned the parking lot into something between a war zone and a cleansing fire. Figures emerged from each helicopter, military bearing, combat boots, the particular walk of men and women who'd spent careers making decisions that ended in body bags. Naval intelligence, Laura recognized. The insignia, the gear configuration, the way they moved as a unit despite the chaos. Their commander, a lean woman with captain's bars and eyes like winter Atlantic, stepped directly into the hospital's main entrance without breaking stride. "We're looking for Major Bennett." Not a question. A command delivered to every person in the lobby at once. "We need her location. Now." The hospital staff froze. Visitors froze. A candy striper pointed upward with a trembling finger, then immediately looked like she regretted it. The naval intelligence team moved toward the elevators, their boots echoing on tile that had heard 1,000 footsteps but never any quite this purposeful. Laura stood motionless at the bus stop, the photo still pressed against the cardboard box. She wasn't inside. She wasn't anywhere that mattered anymore. The rain hammered harder, and she watched the third Black Hawk hover, its side door open, waiting. Then the main entrance doors exploded outward, and Captain Richard Hale emerged in a hospital gown and for still taped to his wrist, moving with the focused intensity of a man operating on pure fury. His daughter Claire was behind him, shouting his name, but he wasn't listening. He was looking at the parking lot. He was looking for her. "She's out there." His voice cut through the wind and rotor wash like steel. Behind him, the Naval Intelligence Commander appeared in the doorway, and Hale grabbed her shoulder. Major Bennett pulled my entire SEAL team out of Tikrit after I ordered the mission scrubbed. Every operator. Under fire. I court-martialed her because I was told to, because what she saved was classified above my clearance. They erased her and told me she died. I believed them. I helped bury a woman who was standing right in front of me 3 days ago. He pointed at the bus stop. "She's out there. In the rain. And she just lost her job because she saved my life." Again. The commander nodded once, and 2 officers immediately jogged toward the parking lot. Laura didn't move. The cardboard box was dissolving. The photograph was dissolving. Everything was water. One of the officers reached her, a hard-faced woman with lieutenant's bars and the kind of presence that made the rain seem to hesitate. "Major Bennett." "Former." Laura's voice sounded like it came from someone else. "That's not real anymore." "It's very real." The lieutenant took the dissolving box gently and handed it to another officer. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, Defense Intelligence Agency. We need you to come with us." Not a request. A command, delivered with the precision of someone who'd given them in combat. "Your service record was sealed, but the seal just got pulled. Commander Price is waiting inside." Laura followed her toward the helicopter, her body moving before her mind caught up. This was extraction. This was how they'd always come for her, sudden, overwhelming, no negotiation. She'd thought she was done with this. She'd thought she was done being someone the government wanted back. The interior of the Black Hawk was all vibration and engine noise, and across from her sat a man in navy dress uniform with commander's insignia and eyes that had seen things that made small talk irrelevant. He opened a file folder and slid it across to her without preamble. "Bronze Star," he said flatly. Laura looked at it. The citation was sanitized, details redacted, but the medal was there in the photograph. Proof of something. Silver Star. Another page. 2 silver stars, actually, 2 separate citations, 2 different operations that the government had decided to acknowledge in writing because pretending they never happened would create paperwork inconsistencies. Defense Superior Service Medal. Commander Price's thumb moved to the next page, and he let the silence expand to fill the cabin before he spoke again. "You were Major Laura Bennett, attached to 160th SAW Night Stalkers as a combat medical officer. You ran trauma operations in 6 different theaters. Your field casualty recovery rate was 98.2%. You saved 47 operators. That number is just the operators we're allowed to acknowledge. One of those operators was the Secretary of Defense's son. He let that settle. After Tikrit, you were reassigned to a Black Ops program that we're still not allowed to discuss. When that program ended, you became a liability. Your identity was burned. You were given a new social security number, new documentation, and a warning never to surface. You were told that Major Bennett died in a convoy attack in 2021. You believed them. Most people would have." Laura stared at the medals. She couldn't remember earning them. She remembered the patients. She remembered hands, her own, others, all of them covered in blood that had turned black in the darkness of helicopter interiors and operating theaters. She didn't remember being decorated for it. The Black Hawk began to move. Through the window, she could see the hospital shrinking below, and beyond it the parking lot where Dr. Ashford was still standing, finally understanding that he'd made a mistake. The helicopter descended again 10 minutes later, and when the door opened, the rain had stopped. Laura stepped out onto the tarmac at a secure facility she didn't recognize, and a massive figure in SEAL Team combat fatigue stepped forward. Barrel-chested, scarred, built like something that had been forged rather than born. His name taped read Holloway, and his eyes held recognition that Laura's brain couldn't process. Major. He saluted, fist to chest, crisp, deliberate, absolute. Gator Holloway, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. You pulled me and 16 operators out of a compound in Tikrit that was burning. You didn't have evacuation authorization. You didn't have command approval. You just loaded us into a bird and flew. His voice was rough, the voice of someone who'd used it for shouting over gunfire and hadn't bothered to soften it since. You saved 47 of us across 6 theaters. That's the number that's in the sealed record. The real number is higher, but we don't talk about it. He extended a hand. Welcome back, Major. We've been waiting for you. Behind him, more operators emerged from the facility, faces that Laura recognized from Tikrit, from Fallujah, from Syria, from places that didn't appear on official maps. They stood in formation, wordless, witnessing her return from the dead. The drive back to Oak Creek Memorial took 17 minutes. Laura rode in the back of a government sedan with Commander Price while FBI vehicles followed at a discreet distance. Price checked his watch, his phone, his posture, all the small gestures of someone executing a precisely timed operation. Dr. Ashford's been accessing classified personnel records, Price said without preamble. 3 times in the past week. When he tried to alter your employment file, the Department of Defense flagged it because your social security number is monitored in a witness protection database. The FBI has documentation of everything, his notes about your employment gap, his contact with a private investigator, his fabricated performance complaints that he uploaded to your digital file. That triggered federal alerts. Price turned to her. He's about to understand what it means to obstruct an investigation involving classified information. The parking lot at Oak Creek Memorial was exactly as it had been an hour earlier, except now there were 4 FBI vehicles and a Department of Defense security team. Hospital staff stood at the windows, pressing their faces against glass. Laura could see them, the nurses who'd retreated from her in the break room, the techs who'd stopped returning her greetings, the residents who'd watched Ashford humiliate her without offering a word. They were about to watch everything reverse. FBI Special Agent Morrison was already moving toward the ICU entrance, a rain-slicked windbreaker and a tablet in his hands. He found Ashford standing near the nurse's station, his confidence finally fracturing as he realized the size of the operation focused on him. Dr. Marcus Ashford. Morrison's voice was conversational, which made it somehow more terrible. I need to talk to you about unauthorized access to classified information systems. Ashford's face went white, not pale, not flushed, but completely drained of blood, the color of someone who'd just understood that his power had been an illusion. I don't know what you're talking about. I run this ICU. I conduct routine HR verification as part of my departmental responsibilities. You accessed Major Bennett's classified personnel file. Morrison turned the tablet so Ashford could see the screen captures. You made notes about her employment gap. You contacted a private investigator named James Whitmore to verify her background. You attempted to add fabricated performance complaints to her digital personnel file, and that triggered a Department of Defense security protocol. Morrison closed the tablet. You're under arrest for federal fraud, obstruction of justice, and unauthorized access to classified information systems. The handcuffs came out, and Ashford finally understood, completely, irrevocably, that he'd lost. His voice rose, the calculated smoothness disappearing, replaced by the raw sound of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. This is absurd. I'm a respected physician. I've been here 15 years. You can't do this. Holloway stepped forward, and Ashford actually stepped backward. The SEAL team leader's voice was low, but it carried the particular gravity of someone who'd spent decades speaking to people on the edge of survival. You fired the woman who saved my life twice. She pulled me out of a burning compound with rounds coming so close the heat was singing my beard. You did it because she made you feel small. You did it because you couldn't stand that she knew more than you in the only moment that mattered. He came closer. You're about to spend a very long time understanding what small really means. Ashford was walked out through the lobby, his wrists secured behind his back, the click of metal audible in the sudden silence. Hospital staff scattered like he'd become radioactive. Laura stood motionless near the entrance, water still dripping from her hair, and watched her former supervisor realize that his entire life had just become someone else's story. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. Laura didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply took one measured breath, the same quiet dignity she'd maintained through every insult, every humiliation, every moment when she could have broken and didn't. Ashford looked away first. He looked away and kept looking away until the FBI vehicle door closed and sealed him inside. 18 months later, Laura Bennett walked through Portsmouth Naval Hospital in service dress uniform, oak leaves gleaming on her collar. The same rank. The same authority. The same woman who'd been buried and had learned to breathe underground. Her office overlooked the trauma training wing where she'd spent the past year and a half rebuilding combat medic protocols based on lessons from Tikrit, Fallujah, Sanjin Valley, and a dozen other places that still woke her at 3 a.m. with phantom screaming. The walls were bare except for one frame, the faded unit patch she'd cut from her jacket lining 3 years ago, the only piece of Major Bennett she'd allowed herself to keep during the erasure. Captain Hale visited quarterly for routine checkups. He and Laura had fallen into an easy rhythm of hospital cafeteria coffee and conversation. He told her stories about his daughter Claire's wedding, about his grandchildren, about the life she'd given back to him twice. Those conversations were never quite comfortable. The weight of court-martial and erasure didn't disappear just because circumstances had reversed, but they mattered in a way that transcended comfort. Commander Price stopped by her office one Thursday afternoon with an update. Dr. Ashford took a plea deal. Avoided prison. He said it like he understood that avoidance of punishment was itself a punishment. His medical license is permanently revoked. Last I heard, he's working as a night security guard at Oak Creek Memorial. Checking doors. Walking the same corridors he used to command. Laura nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. There was no satisfaction in her face, just acknowledgement. The world had righted itself. The scales had balanced. That was enough. That evening, she gave a lecture to incoming Navy corpsmen on field trauma care. Before she began, she held up a piece of MRE packaging, faded, creased, stained with something that might have been blood or might have been time. Sometimes you won't have the right equipment. Sometimes the manual won't cover what's in front of you. Sometimes you'll have to trust what you know instead of what you're told. This packaging saved a man's life when we were 4 minutes from cardiac arrest in a helicopter with no supplies and no authorization to be where we were. She turned the packaging slowly in her hands. The training you receive here is excellent. Learn it. Master it. But remember that the best trauma care isn't found in a textbook. It's found in the space between fear and knowing what matters. A young corpsman raised his hand. Major Bennett, is it true you were erased for 3 years? The room went absolutely silent. Laura set the packaging down on the podium and touched the unit patch on her uniform, just once, just a fingertip against worn fabric. I was hidden, she said quietly. That's not the same as erased. The people I saved remembered, even when the government said I didn't exist. That's what matters. That's what always matters. She dimmed the lights. Now pay attention. This part's important. The lecture began, and Portsmouth Naval Hospital's corridors filled with the sound of her voice, steady, authoritative, carrying the weight of 6 theaters and 47 lives and 3 years of silence that had taught her everything about what brave really meant. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Like this video, add your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Laura's position? And hit that notification bell because we're releasing stories like this one every single week. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes they're pushing mops. Sometimes they're saving lives in the dark. You just have to know where to look.